CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The inaugural China International Import Expo took place in Shanghai this week. It brought together over 3,000 exhibitors from more than 170 countries. The expo comes amid China's call for multilateralism against rising trends of trade protectionism from the United States. Today, we are looking at China's vision for the future of global trade and what it offers African and other emerging economies. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, as the world's second largest economy, China is always looking to open up its markets, particularly to African countries. Imports to China are estimated to hit $10 trillion over the next 5 years. At the Expo, Chinese President Xi Jinping reiterated the importance of multilateralism, announcing a raft of measures to promote China's trade with the world. Hang Peng was in Shanghai this week and has filed this report.
Innovative, inclusive, and open. That's the world economy that Chinese President Xi Jinping envisions. Xi also ensured the global community that China will not close its doors to the world and that its economy remains robust, despite some roadblocks along the way.
The Chinese economy is a big ocean, not a small pond. Sometimes on the ocean, the waves are peaceful and winds steady. Sometimes there are also big winds and rain. Without big winds and rain, it is not an ocean at all. Big winds and rain can destroy a small pond, but not the ocean. After countless winds and waves, the ocean is still there. After over 5,000 years of hardships, China is still here. Facing the future, China will be forever here.
Xi vowed greater efforts in 5 areas to further open China's market. Xi said China will stimulate the potentials of imports, further reduce tariffs and cut international costs, continue broaden market access, opening up industries like finance industry, provide a world-class business environment, and promote multilateral and bilateral cooperation. And it's not just domestic policies that President Xi is keen on ramping up. He has also called upon the whole world to keep open up and fight against trade protectionism. President Xi said economic globalization is an unstoppable trend. He called for all countries to pursue cooperation, not confrontation, win-win situations, not zero-sum games, to build a world of common destiny. Han Peng, CGTN, Shanghai.
My colleague Hang Peng there from Shanghai. Now, let's explore the significance of China's International Import Expo and what it means for Africa and other emerging economies. I'm joined from Beijing by Professor Hong Wenping. She's the Director of African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Also joining me in studio are development economist Antsense Were and Guo Tso, the Economic and Commercial Counselor of the Chinese Embassy in Kenya. To you all, welcome to Talk Africa today. Antsense Were, let me start off with you because the China International Import Expo is the world's first such trade held at the national level. President Xi Jinping, in his opening speech himself, said, and he termed it an important decision by China to pursue a new round of high-level opening up. First, what is your understanding of this expo?
Well, I think it's an indication that Africa has to step up its export game into China. I think one of the key things that has defined African exports into China is obviously it's been commodity driven, whether that's agricultural commodities or fuels and metals and minerals. It's still been commodity driven. So I think from an African perspective, the question for us now is how do we shift into manufacturing? And I think if we link this import expo to some of the pronouncements that were made by Xi Jinping during FOCAC, where there was going to be support for increasing Africa's capacity to export commodities or products and goods that have value addition, what I really want to see as an African perspective is how will China link the emboldening or the strengthening of African manufacturing capacity to this new sort of import pull from the Chinese government. And I think that's the link I'm trying to see.
We're going to look at that link in just a moment. Professor Ho, to you first from China's perspective, what is your understanding of the expo?
I think this Expo itself shows now China's reform and opening up now is entering into a new level. Because during the past 4 decades of the reform and opening, China mainly is serving as the world factory. That is made in China, those products now has been selling to all of the world. As the result of this reform and opening, now China has been serving as the biggest trade partner with as many as 128 countries in whole of the world. So made in China products has been sold all over the world. But now, I think starting from this Expo itself, now China is willing to becoming a world market, no longer a world factory. Now we are welcoming all those good things, products, commodities made in other countries, other continents,
right.
Now all come to China. And let Chinese, those increasing middle classes, those people, now they have deep pocket now, they want to buy. But what kind of thing they can buy? Maybe they need to go abroad to buy. But
right.
Now they even no need to go abroad to buy, they can buy at home. So that's the big change.
Mr. Guo, China is ready to become a world market, according to Professor Ho. So just give us an understanding against what international and domestic environment in China is this continuing opening up taking place?
Yes, I think the CIIE in Shanghai is the biggest thing in China, because this is evidence to prove China want to make the market, open to the world. Is a new level. Actually, according to my understanding, because there are 2 reasons make the China to make decision to make this Expo. The first, to the world, recently, especially one of the founder of WTO, believe that WTO rules is not good for them, so they take the unilateralism, and then they ask the other, maybe the members to follow them. So WTO is in the risk. China now take this Expo. That means to support, the globalization trend, and also support the WTO system. And I think this is to the world. To the domestic market is China, the professor have told China have experienced several decades reform and opening up. And in my opinion, normally China will take, the opening up, the measures to push the domestic reform. And nowadays, China have want to make the world factory to, to make a stronger the trader, a stronger, the biggest trade the country in the world. So we want to, welcome the others, the good qualities, the goods. Also, we welcome the high technology to the China, and that means the competitive well involved in China market will make the China's, the ability to
right.
a new stage.
Right, and of course, Mr. Gore is talking about the changing environment here against which China is pushing for further opening up of its economy via trade. Give us a brief understanding, though, exactly what kind of message is China sending here by further opening up, and against what global environment is this all taking place?
Well, from an African perspective, it's a demographic message, and there are 2 elements of demography being channeled here. First is the growing African market. Africa is growing not only in numbers, but also in GDP per capita. So you're getting more Africans who have more disposable income. So if you look at the global trends, we're the biggest emerging market, and we'll be the biggest market for a long time to come. So it only makes sense that you start using that labor to push products into your country. So that's one thing, is how do we use young African labor, develop the manufacturing capacity on the continent to develop goods that the Chinese market is interested in. One, I think the second demographic element is the reality that China is an aging population. Their working labor force is shrinking, and they're becoming very aware of the fact that the manufacturing capacity that they used to have is not going to be around for much longer. So they need to start figuring out ways on how do we use all this capital that we've accrued over the last 40 years and channel it into a productive effort that channels the goods that we want back into our country. And I think from an African perspective, that's very important. They're looking at the world now as a means through which they can get the goods that they perhaps could have been manufacturing on a larger scale before,
right.
But the demographic reality in China is changing, but they still want access to a certain level of product. And so really for the African perspective is, first of all, how do we use our demographic dividend of young labor to really drive goods into China? And secondly, from a Chinese perspective is the fact that we do have an aging population. How do we make sure we still get the goods that the increasingly sophisticated domestic Chinese market wants?
China is now saying they would want to spend about $10 trillion over the next 5 years in trade and services. How is Africa positioning itself then to take advantage of this opportunity?
Well, I think Africa has to position itself as a destination for manufacturing. I think if you look globally, Africa is the best place in terms of labor, and we're young enough for our labor to be skilled up to become a manufacturing powerhouse. Now, there's a combination of factors that have to happen here. One is very clear government policy that facilitates manufacturing investment into the continent, but the second is really getting the skills up and the technology, because the manufacturing that Africa will be doing is not the manufacturing that China was doing. We're in the age of the Internet of Things, we're in the age of smart technology. There'll be a lot of automation in manufacturing in Africa. So right. The type of manufacturing that we need to attract to become the next sort of manufacturing powerhouse is a very different story to what China did, 30, 40 years ago.
Mr. Guo, this comes back to the recent FOCAC summit and exactly the 8-point plan that was laid out by China. Though, how do we see, though, the 8 action plans of the 2018 FOCAC summit in Beijing facilitating further China-Africa trade?
Yes, the FOCAC actually is focused on the trade facilitation, and China also want to take the CIIE is a great opportunity to the African country. For example, during the CIIE, and China, have make the least developing countries to join this Expo. Is the free expense. That means all the fees will be free. And on the other side is China's government agency will carry out the cooperation with the African countries. For example, SPS, the measures, and also some, the quality inspection. All this field, China will take the cooperation with African countries that make the African countries on the capacity will upper to reach the standard of China.
Right, and Africa has for a long time been talking about no longer being just selling its raw materials, but also becoming a destination for value add. To value add, you need industries and manufacturing. Does Africa have that capacity?
Well, clearly we don't now. I think if you look at Africa, we have a blend of capacities. I think broadly our strongest areas, certainly in Kenya, is food and beverages and fast-moving consumer goods. But one of the fundamental things people don't seem to understand about value addition is that it's actually linked to agriculture. If you look at textiles, if you look at leather, shoes, if you look at furniture, if you look at a lot of the light industries, it needs a lot of agricultural inputs. And if Africa's agriculture continues to lag beyond the commodity of exports of certain very niche products, if in general that doesn't increase, the drive to provide inputs into manufacturing will be very limited. Manufacturing needs inputs, right? And if you look at the way a lot of African manufacturing is structured, a lot of the inputs are imported. And even now, even if you look at the apparel manufacturing in Kenya, people import fabric. We're not manufacturing it ourselves. So it's a long story, and I think we're beginning to understand that it's really a value chain that we need to use, and we need the value chain approach if we're going to step up to the manufacturing plate in a credible manner.
Mr. Guo, just adding on to that value add position though, if you can just give us a brief on exactly which sectors do you think that Africa's commodities or African trade can be of benefit to China?
If you want to build the more and more factories in Africa in a short time, it's impossible. But in Africa, just like His Excellency President Uhuru Kenyatta have said, we have very strong agriculture. So I think agricultural goods will be available to export to China. So just like Kenya said, also mentioned, avocado, maybe pension, maybe the beef, all of the agricultural goods, I think this is will satisfy the demand of Chinese market, because nowadays Chinese people like organic, like the green food. But especially in Kenya, Kenya is a very the best location. Is the more and more the raining. So I think these areas produce the agricultural goods is the best level for the Chinese market.
Briefly though, Anzete, aside from agriculture, which other sectors do you think could be of interest to China though from Africa's commodities?
I think two things. One, we haven't done the analysis on this, and I think there's a massive gap in terms of the import potential from Africa into China. That has to be done on a country level. As Kenya, where is China's demand for goods coming from? Where is the high demand coming from? What is Africa's capacity to meet that? And we need that for two things. We need to know what China wants that we're already good at producing and start with that. And then we need to know what China wants we're not good at producing and start producing that. So we need to do that work, whereas the analytical work of this is a Chinese market, this is how we're going to break into it. A lot of guesstimation is happening right now. People are using anecdotal evidence, but the holistic analytical work hasn't been done. I think that's one thing. I think secondly, the only way this will actually make sense for Africa has been said is through manufacturing. And the only way that will happen is if cost of production goes down in Africa. It is incredibly expensive to do business in Africa right now. As much as we say we have a young labor market, as much as we say wages are relatively low, try moving a product or a good from an African port into a Chinese port and compare that to what is done in Asia within its own border. So beyond the labor force and sort of the ability for us to feed that market, the reality is that cost of production has to go down, and that links into infrastructure development, and that links now into the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's really a multifaceted approach that will be required for Africa to really launch into being a proper exporter into the Chinese market.
All right, and Sensei Were and Mr. Guo and Professor Ho Weng-Ping, do stay with us for the moment. We'll continue with this discussion. We're going to take a short break now, but don't go away. The conversation continues on Talk Africa in a short while. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington, and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms, and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Today we are looking at the China International Import Expo. My guest, Professor Ho Weng-Ping in Beijing, and Sensei Were in Nairobi, and Mr. Guo Tse here in studio. Let's continue our discussion on China's position to continue opening up and what it means for global trade. And Sensei, there's going to be a lot of negotiation from all parties here. And one of the things that President Kenyatta asked of China was that China to give preferential treatment to goods coming from Africa. Your thoughts?
I mean, it's going to be a geopolitical game. I think the Kenyan government is aware of the preferential access we have to the U.S. and to certain European markets, and they want to secure that to the Chinese markets. The only concern I have with that is that it may further entrench the commodity-driven model that Africa is doing. Because if you look at, particularly in the European markets, we're commodity-driven. In AGOA, we're a bit different in that we're apparel-driven from a Kenyan perspective. But really, if we're going to ask for that preferential access, that has to be a tool for industrialization. We need to be asking for preferential access to goods and services that drive the manufacturing capacity of the continent. Otherwise, we do risk just staying in this rut of being commodity-driven. I think, secondly, the biggest problem I have with that is we won't be competitive. And I think one of the reasons we've seen the trade imbalance between China and Africa is because China is making what Africa wants, Africa isn't making what China wants. And if we don't fix that, this trade deficit is going to be continuing, because that China can open up its market, but if we're not making what Chinese products consumers want, then it's not a very useful thing. So sometimes these agreements that we do in order to sort of secure deals for our people are well intended, but ultimately we're not solving the ultimate problem, that is Africa making what Chinese consumers want? If the answer is no, then we need to recognize that and fix it.
But let me ask that to Mr. Gould. Yes, of course, is Africa making what China wants?
Yes, actually, I just want to make an explanation about special treatment. And I think His Excellency President Uhuru want a special treatment is about the tariff issue. Because China have gave the least developing countries, in Africa, 97% of the goods to China, the tariff is the 0. Yes, but to the other countries, for example, like Kenya is not belong to the LDC. That means the least developing countries. So the Kenya nowadays cannot, receive the special treatment for the LDC. So Kenya said, have, suggest several times, want to also enjoy this special treatment for the LDC. But I think maybe in the future, China will take some, to consider this, suggestion. But I think the pre-standard is China must follow the WTO rules, and for the goods to the, especially for the trade of what kind of trade from Africa can offer to China. I think the service trade is very special, especially for the Kenya. Kenya have no, the gas, have no oil, but Kenya have the animals. Kenya is belong to the leading safari, game countries. So more and more Chinese people like, spend holidays in Kenya, every year. I think maybe over 140 million Chinese will, go abroad to have a tourist. But in Africa, it's with very low amount. In the future, Africa have a very special, especially on the environment, especially some animals and the big five.
Right.
So this scenery will abstract Chinese people to visit Kenya, to visit China.
Right.
Yes.
Professor Ho, I do want to come to China's domestic situation now, and just to get a feeling from you as to what this means for China's domestic population and policies. Do you feel that the Chinese people will fear the competition coming from external trade?
Yes, there is kind of a talking. Actually, nowadays in China, some are worried, saying if all those foreign commodities, especially those very good one, very high quality one, all flooded in China. So how will those Chinese companies to face, this kind of challenge? Maybe this is a thing, maybe push them, even close the factory. They're no longer to need to make their own productivity products anymore. So this is kind of worry, to be honest. But we also, like we enter into WTO, like 40 years ago, we open our door widely. So this is kind of challenge. You have to face the challenge, because in our leaders' words, that is using the outside force, to counter, against those kind of you push them to do the more innovative reform. Those Chinese company, maybe they are no longer, they becoming, very comfortable about their own, like they can enjoy a lot of domestic market share. That's it. They think it's okay.
Right.
They no need to go abroad. So now this is a kind of a force to drive them forward, to make new innovative drive, to make more those, make the products more beautiful, more competitive. So actually it's not a bad thing. Maybe
Right.
for the short time, in the near future, is a kind of challenge. But if you look at it in the long-term way, I think which is a good thing for the further and the deeper reform and also opening up for China.
To get another sense from you, though, why China chose to open up at this time when its economy was slowing down?
Yes, I think I have given this explanation, in the beginning. That means we experience the process of the China exception to the WTO. That means at that time, when the China access to the WTO, China government will decide which industry will be opened, which industry will be protected. But in my view, all the industry without any protection now have become the #1 in the world. All the industry, the completely protection now is still weak. So China nowadays, I think, want to, the opening up to push domestic reform again. So China at that time to, absolute the foreign goods, the absolute abstract, the high technical from the other countries to China. That means make the Chinese market competition again. So I think this is a very strong activities from the Chinese government to make the Chinese economy to make a new stage.
All right, and
Yes.
so we're talking about a China-Africa trade, but Africa is a continent of 54 countries. Recently, though, the Continental Free Trade Area came into force. How do you see Africa, though, taking advantage of the opportunities offered through the CFTA to find a bigger market for the continent as a whole and to find that market in China?
I think the AFCTA is really going to be an opportunity for more of a reciprocal relationship. I think with China opening up and letting imports in, we've already talked about that, but I think China wants something in return. And I think the way Africa can use that usefully is using the Belt and Road Initiative to interconnect Africa in the context of the free trade area. We have 54 countries that are very poorly connected. We have 54 countries that have different currencies. So I think one of the things that we need to do in the context of making Africa more competitive is, first of all, developing a China strategy from an African perspective. What are we trying to do with China? How are we trying to leverage this? But also making it easier to manufacture and move things around the continent so that we find the right points to which it can be exported into China. So there's a lot of work we have to do domestically in terms of interconnecting the continent, in terms of creating regional value chains. Some countries are better at growing things, some have better processing and manufacturing capacity, creating regional value chains that are more competitive, that then use a solid infrastructure to export into the Chinese
Mr.
economy.
Go, you have the final thoughts on this and how exactly Africa can tap into the opportunity provided by China's position of continuing opening up.
I think, in my opinion, I gave the Africa advice is to promote the development of the investment. And I remember when the China just carry out the opening up the policy, and the first task for Chinese government is abstract the foreign investment in China, ask the foreign investors to build factories in China. So after the 4 decades, China become the world factory nowadays. And Africa, I think, because we have so many young men, and actually it's a very young continent, as actually it's a potential market. For this, if we want to develop, the first thing is promote the environment for investment. I think during this process, the foreign investor will offer more and more the jobs for the local people. And also during this process, the technique will be transferred to the local people. And I think if you do this after several decades, China's today will be the future of Africa.
All right, very insightful thoughts there. And that's all we have time for this week on the program. And thank you to my guests for sharing their insights. From Beijing, Professor Ho Wenping, the Director of African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And from Nairobi, development economist Antete Were and Mr. Guo Te, the Economic and Commercial Counselor at the Chinese Embassy in Kenya. Remember, you can keep the conversation going online on Facebook and Twitter. You can also find this and previous episodes of Talk Africa on YouTube and the CGTN Africa website. Tune in again next week for more analysis and in-depth conversation with Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team in Nairobi, goodbye.